It had to happen eventually. When one of the most popular sitcoms of the late 70s was a nostalgia piece about the 1950s, and then one of the most popular sitcoms of the 2000s was a nostalgia piece about the late 70s, 80s nostalgia could only be just so far behind. It's kind of strange seeing the time of my youth being held up as some sort of golden age, but then I've seen stranger things.
Look around, leaves are brown, and the sky is a hazy shade of winter. Grass is high, feels alright. It's the springtime of my life.
Precise origins are hard to pin down, but the nostalgia film can almost certainly be traced to George Lucas's 1973 film American Graffiti.
Where were you in 62?
A fond look back at the cruising scene of the early 60s. Following four friends on the last night they'll spend together in their hometown, the film eschewed traditional plot structure and essentially gave birth to the teen hangout movie, a genre which would produce many subsequent entries, often, if not always, looking back on a bygone time. The 2009 film Adventureland, clearly cut from the same cloth as Graffiti, was on the precipice of the oncoming 80s nostalgia wave. That same year would see the big screen adaptation of Watchmen, a graphic novel that had been written and set in the 1980s, and whose film adaptation would retain its original period time frame despite early studio opinions about modernizing the setting, as well as Ty West's House of the Devil, a slow-burn horror flick that played like a love letter to the films of John Carpenter. One thing leads to another, and the same year produced Easy A film which was similarly reverent to the films of John Hughes and the decade in general.
I want my life to be like an 80s movie.
But the fuse really got lit by J.J. Abrams' Super 8, a blockbuster homage to the works of Steven Spielberg and his contemporaries, sprinkling in bits of everything from Close Encounters to The Goonies. It was such an effective evocation of wide-eyed 80s adventure films that it hardly mattered that the film was actually set in 1979. This shit's not really important. 80s references began popping up in films that weren't even set in the 80s.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen.
Not now, 80s robot.
Might I offer you a drink?
I'll take one. Thanks. And in 2016, when the Netflix series Stranger Things premiered, it was as if some sort of critical mass had been achieved. The 80s were now more or less officially the new cool thing. Unlike some previous entries in this burgeoning 80s revival, which unobtrusively occupied some portion of the decade, Stranger Things took the 80s influence and dialed it up to, well, 11.
It's one louder, isn't it?
It almost acts as a sort of Cliff Notes version of the decade for anyone who wasn't around then. Its name star is grown-up Winona Ryder.
She's bodacious.
An actual 80s teen star now playing the mother of teenage Leonardo DiCaprio, a shy kid dying for the affections of teenage Rooney Mara, who would rather hang out with the tough kid played by teenage Kyle MacLachlan. The real stars, though, are the kids. You know, basically those same kids from Super 8, only played by different actors. They ride their bikes around, get kidnapped, run afoul of evil authority figures, fight monsters, and try and solve the mystery behind the psychic girl played by tween Natalie Portman. The usual. There's Ghostbusters and D&D, arcades and horror films, divorced parents and paranoia.
I'm talking a full-on Russian invasion right here in Hawkins.
And of course a second season that arrived in 2017, the year that the phenomenon reached its apotheosis.
Get ready for an 800-foot statue of Pac-Man with Skeletor and Heather Locklear.
The sophomore season introduced new characters, including Carter Burke from Aliens, grown-up Mikey the Goonie.
What's at the X? Pirate treasure?
As well as teenage Heather Graham. And, probably quite fortuitously, it came out just a month and a half after another bomb had hit.
Would you like a balloon?
After years of false starts,
It is here.
the big screen adaptation of Stephen King's best-selling novel finally appeared in theaters in September of 2017, with its time period updated from the 50s to the late 80s, motivated possibly by the success of Stranger Things, with which it shares a cast member. The most financially successful horror film ever released, it not only captured the feel of its source novel, but the feel of the 1980s as well. But for the technical achievement of some of the special effects, it feels like it could have been made in the 1980s. But what does that really mean? I mean, it's not as if the decade only produced one style of film, But when people say a film has an 80s feel, they're probably not talking about Gandhi or Terms of Endearment or frankly any of the films that took home a Best Picture award that whole decade. They're talking about more specific things. It's not hard to understand why tearjerkers, biopics, and war films were staples of cinema long before the 80s, and they would continue to be. So when we say an 80s film, we tend to think of things that originated in the 80s, and more often than not, things that stayed in the 80s. Stranger things. So what made the 80s a decade with a distinctive identity? Besides hair.
Do 4 puffs of the Farrah Fawcett spray.
Farrah Fawcett spray?
Yeah.
One major factor was the rise in popularity of both sci-fi and horror movies. Now these had long been staples of cinema, but they tended to be relegated to the status of low-budget B-movies and not the studio's primo offerings. Successful films in these genres tended to be prestige pictures with artful aspirations, but in the late 70s, highly successful entries in both brought about scores of imitators. Star Wars, a space adventure styled after 1930s matinee serials, was not only the most successful sci-fi film ever, it was in its day the most successful motion picture of all time. Somewhat more modest but no less influential, John Carpenter's Halloween became the most profitable independent film ever, making back more than 200 times its production budget. Studios clued in. There was money to be made in these less respected genres.
To the max, dude.
And throughout the 80s, some of the most profitable films were sci-fi or horror, or in some cases, both.
Oh, wonderful. We have to get these two together.
But both sci-fi and horror have remained staples of cinema since then, so what gave the 80s its unique identity? Well, there were other things that had been brewing. In 1970, campaigning by women for easier access to divorce resulted in the no-fault divorce law, courtesy of, somewhat surprisingly, then California Governor Ronald Reagan. Other states adopted the law throughout the decades, and divorce rates saw a steady and dramatic rise as marriages, which were not plagued by abuse or infidelity, but which were simply unhappy unions, began dissolving at a prolific rate, reaching a national peak in 1980.
Maybe you ought to call your father and tell him about it.
I can't. He's in Mexico with Sally.
That and other economic factors saw a major slump in household income, with the result that the old paradigm of dad goes to work and mom stays at home with the kids
They gave me another raise.
became a thing of the past, resulting in the phenomena of what were then called latchkey kids. Kids who, from the time they got home to when their parents got off work and during the summer, for pretty much the entire day, were essentially self-supervised.
You're a big boy now. I mean, you're old enough to stay home alone without making a fuss.
This new normal quickly found its way into the films of the time, which often saw kids as essentially their own subset of society, rarely interacting with parents.
The night the teenagers ruled the world.
Sci-fi and horror films began to skew young. The Satan-focused horror films of the 70s gave way to teen slasher films, where young people were often the most frequent victims of often unstoppable killers.
Like Michael Myers.
It was a transgressive tactic that would have been unthinkable in previous times, and sci-fi and adventure films tilted even younger, featuring sometimes pre-teen protagonists that often had to solve major problems without any adult help. This was apparently a point of contention for millennial viewers of Stranger Things, who found it unbelievable that kids could get away with so much unsupervised time away from home. Let me just pause a moment to say, no wonder your generation is so fucking lame! Oh my god! Not only could we do that, we did do that all the time! There was a certain radius to stay within and a time to be home by, but basically we rode our bikes where we liked, tromped around in the woods, hung out together in basement rooms that adults never entered unless there was a load of laundry to do. All of it. Art was merely imitating life. The films of John Hughes, for example, painted a strong divide between the adults and the kids. Adults were often seen as almost villains, or at least pathetically out of touch.
When you grow up, your heart dies.
Many young people may have felt that the previous generation had failed them, though many, including myself, relished our freedom. We were expected to have some measure of responsibility for our own lives. And kids in 80s films were often put in genuine danger.
What kind of danger?
Danger! Danger!
He's not kidding. The films of the time didn't pull punches in their treatment of young people, and it wasn't unusual for films featuring young characters to have R ratings either. Everyone knew kids watched them anyway, and the kids in them were simply portrayed as people in films that didn't dismiss their lives as being less important. Kids in the lead roles didn't necessarily relegate it to the status of a kids' movie, which necessarily lacked adult appeal. Drama was drama either way. But what was a cheerable moment in a film from the 80s would likely make modern-day parents turn white with horror.
Suck my fat one, you cheap dime store hood.
Yes, young kids brandishing deadly weapons were hardly unheard of in films of those times. Whether it reflected or encouraged personal agency among kids, the popular media of the day made it a staple. In a time when schools discourage and even punish kids for fighting back against bullies, the films of the 80s displayed no such timidity. In reclaiming their ability to stand up for themselves, offerings like It and Stranger Things return agency to the young characters who are not simply baggage on an adult character's journey.
She's our friend and she's crazy!
The adult population of It's fictional town of Derry is not merely out of touch, but in many ways casually complicit with the evil that lurks there. Only the young even recognize its presence. The kids of Stranger Things at least have one strong ally in the town sheriff, notably the one adult who is tragically no longer a parent, but another bogeyman of the 80s sits in its midst.
You know, that thing.
The decade was the last one for the Cold War and the first for home computers. The Soviet Union was invading Afghanistan, the US was publicly opposing them.
We cannot and will not turn our backs on this struggle.
And as a result, fears of a nuclear conflict were higher than they'd been since the Cuban Missile Crisis. As exuberant a decade as it could be, there was also a definite sense of gloom and doom hovering over it all. It was certainly part of director Zack Snyder's insistence on keeping Watchmen's original time frame intact. There's simply no equivalent threat in modern days.
I could find a souvenir just to prove the world was here. And here is a red balloon. I think of you, let it go.
And well before computers became a normal part of everyday life, there was a definite sense of mistrust attached to them, as though technology was going to be a deciding factor in ushering in our doom.
Is this a game, or is it real? What's the difference? Oh, wow.
Decided our fate in a microsecond.
Movies like The Terminator, which in many ways I would consider the quintessential 80s film, took a dim view of humanity's desire to push forward technology, especially weaponizable technology.
I don't even know why the scientists make them.
Stranger Things has its equivalent of Cyberdyne systems in Hawkins' lab, where the Department of Energy attempts to tap the power of the human mind to make a psychic weapon and inadvertently unleashes terrors from another world.
He's had a distaste for science.
The young girl, initially known only as 11, refers to her handler as though he's technically her kidnapper and not a real father. It continues the theme of distrust and authority, and parents in particular. People love to talk about the wonder of childhood and forget just how much it can really suck.
Is your mommy here?
No, sir. Actually, she's out at the market buying Pampers for all us kids.
All authority, even well-intentioned authority, is intimidating to a kid.
What is that?
Oh shit, what?
You're a functioning sentient being, but you're the bottom rung on the ladder and generally dismissed as being of minor importance. Seriously, was there ever a more casually dismissive and insulting term?
I blame you!
That's okay, kid. That's okay.
No, nothing about this is okay!
A lot of parents really do seem to forget what it's like to be so powerless. It's no wonder role-playing games and video games enjoy so much popularity. You can be really good at something that baffles your parents. Being a kid with real power is a fantasy most of us can relate to. And the series follows in the footsteps of its forebears, reveling in the freedom of youth and allowing its young characters to have real agency in their lives and fulfill the desire of most well-adjusted people.
We don't have to leave the Goonda!
At the same time, it also shows the real danger that can result from its misuse, sparked by a clash between the two strongest characters, each of whom is missing something that the other provides, and both of whom have to learn how to relate to the other in terms of their respective power. It makes me wonder if future seasons will delve into the potential consequences of a character who's so powerful she's only limited by the constraints of her conscience. After all, it does seem as though that power is derived primarily from anger.
I want you to find something from your life. Something that angers you.
Let the heat flow through it.
Fortunately, unlike some parents in the show, Hopper is a decent guy who earns the respect of those around him as well as ours. And while I'm not over fond of portraying scientists as villains out to ruin our lives when our lives have been bettered by science in more ways than we could actually enumerate, it does set up a great reversal of expectations in Season 2, where Papa's replacement is played by Paul Reiser, who played company man Carter Burke from Aliens, and ends up being a good guy, subverting the expectations of many viewers who were probably conditioned to mistrust him on sight. While at times it can feel as though it's about to veer into Michael Crichton-esque paranoia.
Your scientists were so preoccupied with whether or not they could, they didn't stop to think if they should.
It's far more notable that all of our young heroes are actually science lovers who use their growing knowledge of science to fight the forces that threaten their town. Actual 80s films would have been more likely to view science and technology as the cause of their woes.
I was planning to hit the Pentagon next week. With the information I can access, I can run things 900 to 1,200 times better than any human.
Ah! These computer things are just a waste of time anyway.
Of course, not all technology was held in disdain.
Like the arcade.
Oh, they may have been held in low regard by then Surgeon General C. Everett Koop, but video games were the shit. While some arcades managed to last into the 90s and a few struggled on elsewhere in isolated spots here and there, you could hardly throw a rock in the 80s without hitting at least 5 of them. All the fear-mongering in the world about their supposed ill effects upon the youth didn't stop those quarters from flying out of pockets at a staggering rate. Before they became a primarily home-based form of recreation, the games were caused to get out of the house, in large part due to the vast disparity in game quality. And just to be clear, these are the arcade graphics, the good ones. These are the graphics for the home version. And if you wanted to take a game on the go, this was what you were stuck with. Before Game Boy or shit on your phone, this is what we ate up. We played the fuck out of these things.
Gnarly.
And hell, when I was 14, my mom would drop me at the arcade for hours on end, just like the kids in the show. It was no big deal, it was totally normal. Though this brings up an often asked question, is the show simply stuffing in 80s references for their own sake, or does it only feel that way now because of the vastly changed cultural landscape? As I said earlier, the show isn't subtle about its time frame, but frankly, the 80s weren't a subtle time. They suffered from a, how do you put this?
A deplorable excess of personality.
Yeah, that was it. They were garish and overdone. People were snorting handfuls of cocaine and then hitting the sewing machines to crank out new fashions, many of which were roundly terrible, and nowhere is this more apparent than in actual 80s movies, which make Stranger Things look restrained and conservative by comparison. Nothing in it is as atrociously 80s-esque as this outfit Robert Downey Jr. is wearing in Weird Science. Nancy isn't wearing 3 cans of hairspray, there isn't a perm every 5 feet. Yeah, they spend a lot of time in an arcade, but look at real movies from the period and you'll find that in abundance. Yeah, they played D&D and showed off their Star Wars toys, but so did the kids in E.T. They had posters for then popular movies, but frankly, I still have those.
Take that down. It's inappropriate.
Hey, fuck you, man. Evil Dead rocks! If anything, it occasionally got the period details wrong. That's not an 80s era Millennium Falcon. This is! You can tell, because, like, it looks a lot shittier than the new ones and nothing like the thing in the movie. And nobody in 1984 would have referred to the Ghostbusters gear as
proton packs?
That was a term coined by the real Ghostbusters cartoon, which didn't premiere until 1986, and though it was subsequently adopted for Ghostbusters 2, the original film referred to them as positron colliders, which slightly changed in order to enable kids to have any hope of being able to pronounce the name when they begged their parents to buy them the toy version of it. Similarly, no one in '84 would have referred to KFC. The company was known by its full name of Kentucky Fried Chicken until 1991.
Do your research.
Of course, the show also has a multitude of metatextual references, such as name-dropping Poltergeist, a wildly popular 1982 horror film about a kid who's abducted by supernatural forces into another dimension and communicates through household technology. The kid's flight from encroaching military forces, accompanied by a strange friend with telekinetic powers, recalls a similar bike chase in E.T., only with a much cooler payoff and without that schmaltzy-ass ending. The idea of a monster from another world is referenced by obvious references to The Thing, and less obvious references to Predator in the names of Sheriff Jim Hopper and Hawkins, Indiana.
They did the same thing to Jim Hopper. I want Hawkins' body found.
Even the episode titles were often little self-aware winks. The Weirdo on Maple Street evokes the classic Twilight Zone episode The Monsters Are Due on Maple Street, and The Body was the name of the Stephen King short story that was filmed as Stand By Me. Another obvious touchstone for the series, and a rather curious piece of 80s nostalgia, given that the film was itself a piece of 50s nostalgia. Kind of like Back to the Future. The 80s were a messed up time. Season 2 saw a titular reference to 80s hero Mad Max in the classic Cornpone Flicks action movie Dig Dug, for which we received no compensation or royalties from those producers at all. Or maybe it was the game, I don't know, one way or the other. The show is absolutely chock full of references for the amusement of its primary viewing demographic of millennials? Seriously? Do they even know what they're watching when they're watching it? I mean, they know this isn't the internet, right? That these guys are using. They know the kids aren't fiddling with some weird sort of overcomplicated cell phone in these scenes, right? Do they get that? Huh. So then the show's appeal lies beyond a simple trip down memory lane. In fact, it seems to have inspired a bout of golden age thinking amongst its younger viewers, many of whom seem to be pining for a childhood they never actually got to have.
No, John Hughes did not direct my life.
Be careful what you wish for, not because you might actually get it, because the times they ain't a-changing back, but because people of my generation will laugh at you for thinking you could actually make it back then. Consider, this was actually considered a pretty bitchin' computer setup for the day.
I shall take the liberty of using my modem to locate the Muppets.
Damn, dial-up bullshit. And if you wanted a cell phone, this was your option. And you had to actually use it as a phone, not like a tricorder or something. Tablets, they didn't exist. This was the technology that E.T. had to use to phone home.
Phone, try again.
Oh, shut the fuck up. And that film with that guy, you know, the one that came out with that other guy in it, what was the name? Oh shit, I can't remember. Well, this thing's not gonna fucking tell you. You'd have to either remember on your own or just go nuts. Because there was no IMDb or Google, there was no YouTube or streaming music or Blu-ray releases just a few months after the film came out in theaters. How do you think that was?
Bummer.
And this was my first copy of The Empire Strikes Back. It's VHS quality, it has no bonus features, it's pan and scan, it took 4 years to come out on home video, and it cost $80 fucking dollars! This packaging is hilarious because it's a joke. If this had actually been a real tape inside, instead of the 4K discs we had paid for, we'd all be pissed. You'd be pissed too. And on top of all that, people tend to remember all the great films and forget the crap. Sure, 1984 produced The Terminator, Ghostbusters, Temple of Doom, 16 Candles, and Spinal Tap, but it also produced a shit ton of films I've never even heard of. For every Blade Runner, there were a dozen Metal Storms and Dungeon Masters and Space Hunters. There are good and bad points to any period in time, sure. We had Star Wars toys to play with. But I'd totally have turned to the dark side for one of these when I was a kid. You know, we had bands that were just some guy with a terrible hairdo and a synthesizer. On the upside, Justin Bieber hadn't even been born yet. We had guys wearing crop tops, possibly the worst fashion decision in the history of clothes. Sorry, Johnny, but you had this coming. On the other hand, if a girl dressed that way, there weren't hand-wringing articles everywhere whining about how it's just so wrong and problematic. And yeah, sure, the hair was ridiculous.
You mullet-wearing asshole!
But nobody thought metallic snot rockets were endearing.
Grody to the max.
And yeah, it was a good time for sci-fi, but a terrible time for comic book movies. If you told kids like the ones in this show that someday there'd be a huge, massively budgeted, interconnected world of comic book movies,
Like the X-Men?
they'd have shit themselves with joy until you told them how long they'd have to wait to see it. And while 80s kids might have pined for that intact nuclear family they saw on things like Happy Days, we weren't treated like toddlers well into our teens.
I know that parents now can like track their children, like where they are at all times, where I remember when we went out with our friends, it was just like freedom.
Maybe young people are looking back at a time that they never got to experience with envy. I'd never go back to the 80s now even if I could, but I'm so glad I grew up then instead of now when there was actual time to be a kid.
Something has got to be done about your kids.
Instead of having your life hyper-scheduled with music classes and after-school activities and sports leagues and SAT test rehearsals all crammed into the day like the world's worst game of temporal Tetris. And the worst part is, even people of my own generation seem to disdain giving their own kids similar freedom to what they had themselves, with the bizarre excuse of, "This is the 21st century." Yeah, it is, and you know what that means? It's safer. Crime has significantly and steadily dropped since then, while perception of danger has stayed about the same. But the only crime to see a steep increase in modern times has been video piracy.
Make all the illegal copies you want.
Good luck keeping your kids away from that one.
Oh, I'm so scared.
The fact is, the kids of Stranger Things probably wouldn't have had time to save their friends in hometowns if they were living today, which is probably why the show's creators, who weren't even born themselves until 1984, chose the setting that they did.
So much easier.
Well,
really,
the existence
of
a cell phone. Well, you don't have to do that cliche, the horror movie thing where like I can't get the signal.
The easier real life becomes, the harder it is to write compelling drama when you want to have characters struggle to overcome obstacles and not just go to Google for a pre-existing answer. And there's no sign that this trend is going to be slowing down anytime soon as more creators look to a more visceral past for inspiration. But ultimately, is Stranger Things just a look back with rose-colored glasses, or does it bring anything new to the table? Actually, it does, because it's a TV series. While it might crib ideas from 80s movies, 80s television was nothing like this. In fact, most of it was pretty terrible.
This is the thanks I get?
TV provides the advantage of a continuing story, the chance to do new things with characters who would be allowed to evolve. Steve Harrington starts off the series as being something of a self-centered douchewad, but by the second season, he'd grown into the coolest character on the show.
He's awesome.
Our introduction to Sheriff Hopper seems to be setting him up to be a loser.
You look like hell, Chief.
By the end, he's emerged as a full-blown hero who is very good at his job and is the moral center of the series. The kids on bikes fleeing the government scene may have originated with Spielberg, but his version has a glaring flaw. These three assholes. Who are they? We don't even know them, and what we do know about them isn't even particularly endearing. Why would they get the honor of stepping into this adventure at the final act? When the Duffer Brothers gave us their version, it was entirely populated by characters we knew by then as real people. So while the 80s might have provided the inspiration for the show, it's only the vast differences in how TV is produced and distributed these days that allows for a series like this to exist at all. It's really a case of the best of both worlds. And just as the struggle of Hawkins citizens spans the generational gap, so has the appeal of the show. Maybe it'll inspire millennials to raise their kids to be less obnoxious than they are. Though if their generation was raised by my generation, it does sort of bring up the question of who exactly is to blame here.
What happens to us in the future? What, we become assholes or something?
All I know for certain is that it's no fault of mine. My kids turned out just fine. They all have 4 legs and tails and don't run around on cell phones 24/7. And even if my generation finds it to be a bittersweet trip back to the good old days, so what? After being pathologized for ages as a potentially debilitating emotional problem, new research has suggested that nostalgia actually makes people happier and more optimistic about the future.
See, it all works out in the end, doesn't it?
Gag me with a spoon.
So, is 80s nostalgia here to stay? Hell no. Eventually it's going to roll over into 90s nostalgia, and then on down the line. Though I do wonder what those future nostalgia films about our current time period are even going to be about. Texting and taking pictures of your food, that time you were in a Twitter mob because a celebrity said something you didn't like. Hell, maybe it'll be about how people of all ages were sitting around and missing the 1980s. I can imagine Stranger Things.